Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. A couple of disclaimers to start off the morning. Number one, I battle a couple of conditions. One is the head cold I've been fighting all week. The second is something called vasomotor rhinitis, which means when I get nervous, I get post-nasal drip and I snort, so if I snort, deal with it. I feel I feel terribly unspiritual. Terribly unspiritual right now. We're all family, so I'll admit it. He says, share one word, something that you're thankful to God for, and the first thing that came to my mind was waffles. Aren't I just a carnal scumbag? I'm sorry, but, it's embarrassing. Like, where did that come from? It's amazing, even as you prepare, I'm praying, I'm working inside, but there's things that, go into delivering a message you don't even think about. I've never been here before. I didn't know the church, and so I made a serious mistake of asking Rod what I should wear. You don't ask a single man what appropriate attire. Rod says, clothes. What kind of clothes? Nice clothes. Thanks, Rod. Actually, that's a paraphrase, but it conveys the message. So I wore a jacket to make a first impression, and now that is made, I will take it off. All right. It's been an interesting journey that sees me come here. I've known Rod for over 30 years. Actually, we were roommates for a brief time in Whittier, attended the same church. And it's sometime over about 6 hours of coffee, we can sit and relate a series of events that have kept our friendship strong and ended with me coming to teach at school. It's been an interesting week as well, as Jason shared. Some of our very good friends lost an 8-year-old boy this week. Absolute tragedy. And it's been interesting to see both how hurting people respond to God and how God responds to hurting people. And that's sort of what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be in 3 passages in the Gospels: Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Mark 10, Matthew 20, and Luke 18. We're going to read them all in a row because they're all telling the same story. We'll start with Mark chapter 10. I actually doing the story of Bartimaeus this morning, which is not self-serving, although it may seem that way. But it'd be a great sermon title, right? Bart does Bart. At least I thought it was So we're going to Mark chapter 10, verse 46. Then they came to Jericho, as Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city. A blind man, Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." So they called to the blind man, "Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you." Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked him. The blind man said, "Rabbi, I want to see." "Go," said Jesus, "your faith has healed you." Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. Flip back to Matthew 20. Verse 29. I'm reading in the New International Version because that's what Rod told me to read in. If you have a different version, blame Rod. Matthew 20, verse 29. As Jesus and his disciples were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed him. 2 blind men were sitting by the roadside, and when they heard that Jesus was going by, they shouted, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." The crowd rebuked them and told them to be quiet, but they shouted all the louder, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." Jesus stopped and called them. "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. "Lord," they answered, "we want our sight." Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes. Immediately they received their sight and followed him. Now over to Luke 18. Verses 35 to 43. Verse 35 of Luke 18. As Jesus approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard the crowd going by, he asked what was happening. They told him Jesus of Nazareth was passing by. He called out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Those who led the way rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped and ordered the man to be brought to him. When he came near, Jesus asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" "Lord, I want to see," he replied. Jesus said to him, "Receive your sight. Your faith has healed you." Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus, praising God. When all the people saw it, they also praised God. 3 stories, 3 writers, 3 perspectives. Same basic story. A couple of differences, you probably picked up on it. Matthew mentions 2 babies. Mark mentions he throws his coat aside. The one significant difference is Matthew and Mark say it happened on the way out. Luke appears to say that it happened on the way in. That's not necessarily what he's talking about. I think what happened was that as Jesus was entering Jericho, Bartimaeus was hollering out. But Jesus didn't respond. And Bartimaeus was still there on the way out. We know what Jesus did do on the way into Jericho. He dealt with a man named Zacchaeus. And most of us know Zacchaeus. You've been in church for a while. If you grew up in church, you know that Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. Yes, indeed. So that's what happened on the way in. And we're going to go over these details a little bit later. But before we do, I want to talk about Bartimaeus for a little bit. Get in his head, get in his circumstances. What do we know about him? Well, we know he was blind. But the doctor and me, and I'm a family doctor, when I think about that, I think, well, why? There's only 2 possibilities. Either he was born blind, or he became blind. And when you think about the potential causes of blindness, it helps you understand the way society responded to blind people at that time. When you think about being born blind, the most common cause of a child being born blind is an illness acquired by the mother, passed on to the child. It could be German measles, it could be some other viral infection. It also could be a sexually transmitted disease, such as chlamydia or gonorrhea, that is transmitted to the baby during delivery. When you think of why you could become blind, it was also most likely due to diseases. I doubt it was trauma. You can poke one eye out, but you're really unlucky if you poke out 2. More likely, it was an infection of some sort. Could have been glaucoma. But you understand that 2,000 years ago, people didn't know germ theory. They didn't know that there were viruses and bacteria all over the place. And most of them thought, or many of them thought, that illnesses were a direct result of spiritual forces. And that frequently, disease or debilitation was a punishment from God. And we know that if you flip over to John chapter 9, that's clearly stated by his disciples in reference to another blind man. In John 9, the first verse is there. It says, as Jesus, went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned? This man or his parents, that he was born blind? So when you think of the causes, it matters because it feeds into the society interpreting the condition as being a punishment from God, which changes their response. Because if it's his fault, I'm not responsible for it. And if you think about it, if you heard today that someone in the community had an electrical short and their house burned down and they lost everything they owned, your heart would go out to them. If you hear somebody else who lost everything they owned betting on the Bears this afternoon when the Packers won, you wouldn't feel so sorry and you wouldn't be moved to help because that's their fault. Because that was stupid. So we don't have sympathy for people when they bring it on themselves. But we do when they can't help it. So when you understand that it's quite possible that not only was he blind, but he was blamed by societies for his conditions, and helps you understand his circumstances. And I want you to think about what it was like to be blind back then. He had no job. He had no hope of ever having a job. There was no Israelites with Disabilities Act. There was no Braille Institute. There was no special education. He had no chance to ever have a job. Which means he could never support a family. Which means he would never marry. He would never have a child. He would be alone forever. He could be taken care of by his parents, but his parents, the life expectancy back then, maybe 40 years. He was doomed. And you think about how difficult it was for him to live. He was dependent on people for everything. How do you cook food? How do you get food? How did he bathe? How did he get down to the river? When he was down at the river, who washed his clothes to make sure they weren't stolen? How did he wash his clothes? How did he go to the bathroom? I know how he went to the bathroom, but where did he go to the bathroom? Behind a tree? How would he know if he was behind it? My brain works this way. Every piece of his